Peter Anderson had always known his life was not his own. Born into the powerful Anderson family, he had been raised with a silver spoon, surrounded by wealth, influence, and expectations. Every step he took, every decision he made, had been carefully planned by his father, Richard Anderson, a man feared and respected in the business world. Peter had spent years preparing to take over the family empire. He had attended the best schools, learned the art of negotiation from the greatest minds, and mastered the strategies of business warfare. But there was one thing he had never prepared for: marriage. Hello, family. Welcome to Storytime Betrayal. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Like and share this video to your friends and loved ones. Thank you as you do so. Sit back, relax as we dive into the story. So, when his father called him into the grand dining room that evening, he had no idea his life was about to change forever. Peter sat across from his father at the long mahogany table, a glass of wine in his hand. The chandeliers above cast a warm golden glow over the room, but the atmosphere felt ice cold. His father, a tall man with sharp features and graying hair, took a sip of his whiskey before placing the glass down with a soft clink. His dark eyes met Peter's. "You will marry Stephanie Carter." Peter nearly choked on his drink. He placed the glass down, wiping his mouth as he frowned. "Excuse me?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You heard me, Peter. The wedding is in 2 months. Everything has already been arranged." Peter felt his heartbeat quicken. "Arranged? You expect me to marry a woman I don't even know?" Richard's face remained emotionless. "It's a business decision. The Carters were once one of our biggest competitors, but after their downfall, they lost everything. This marriage will restore their name and strengthen our public image." Peter clenched his fists. "So that's what I am to you? A tool for corporate alliances?" His father sighed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You are an Anderson. You don't get the luxury of choosing your fate. This family's success is built on strategy, not emotions." Peter wanted to argue, to fight back, but deep down he knew it was useless. His father had always made the rules, and he had never allowed disobedience. "This is ridiculous," Peter muttered, pushing back his chair and standing. "I won't marry someone just because you say so." Richard's voice turned cold. "You will marry her, Peter. And if you refuse, consider yourself cut off." Silence filled the room. Peter froze. He knew what those words meant. No money, no inheritance, no business. His father had built the Anderson empire from the ground up, and if Peter lost his place in it, he would have nothing. Richard watched him carefully, his expression calm, knowing he had won. "You don't have to love her," he said, his voice softer now. "You just have to marry her." Peter took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had spent his entire life living under his father's control. Every move he made had been dictated by the expectations of the Anderson family. But marriage? This was too much. But as much as he wanted to fight, he knew the truth. His father would never back down. Without another word, Peter turned and walked out of the room, his fists clenched. This wasn't over. Miles away, in a small but elegant apartment, Stephanie Carter sat on her couch, staring at the diamond ring in her hand. The Andersons had finally come to her. Her lips curled into a bitter smile. She had spent years dreaming of this moment. The Andersons had ruined her family. Her father, Benjamin Carter, had once been a respected businessman, a powerful name in the industry. He had trusted Richard Anderson as a friend and business partner. But Richard had betrayed him. A series of false accusations, fabricated evidence, and corporate manipulation had destroyed the Carter empire overnight. Her father had died of a heart attack from the stress. Her mother, unable to cope with the shame and debt, had taken her own life. And Stephanie had been left alone. She had watched the Anderson family thrive while she struggled to survive. She had worked countless jobs, fought her way through college, and slowly rebuilt herself. But she had never forgotten. She had never forgiven. And now, fate had delivered her the perfect opportunity. A marriage into the Anderson family. A chance to destroy them from the inside. Stephanie looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her dark brown eyes burned with determination. She had learned long ago that power was the only thing that mattered in this world, and she would take it back, one way or another. The day of their first meeting arrived. Peter sat in a luxurious private dining room, waiting. His jaw was tight, his fingers drumming against the table. He had seen pictures of Stephanie Carter before, but that didn't mean he knew anything about her. And he had no interest in knowing her. The door opened. Stephanie walked in, her posture straight, her head high. She was beautiful, no doubt. Long dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through him. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her movements graceful, controlled. Peter stood, offering a polite nod. Stephanie. She gave him a small smile. Peter. They sat across from each other. For a moment, there was silence. Peter finally sighed, leaning back in his chair. Let's get one thing straight. I don't want this marriage any more than you do. Stephanie raised an eyebrow. Then we have something in common. Good, Peter said. Then we keep this simple. We put on a show for the world, and behind closed doors, we stay out of each other's way. Stephanie smiled, but there was something unreadable in her expression. Sounds reasonable. Peter studied her. There was something about her that didn't add up. Most women would have been thrilled to marry into the Anderson family, but she seemed detached, unbothered. And for some reason, that made him uneasy. This woman had secrets. But so did he. And whether they liked it or not, their fates were now tied together. The game had begun. Stephanie Carter had spent years preparing for this moment. She had imagined it 1,000 times, the day she would sit across from an Anderson, poised, confident, and completely in control. But sitting across from Peter now, she realized something. He wasn't what she expected. The Andersons were supposed to be ruthless, manipulative, and arrogant. But Peter? He looked tired, frustrated, maybe even a little lost. She wasn't sure what to make of that. But it didn't matter. She hadn't come here to understand Peter Anderson. She had come here to destroy him. Peter cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Since we both don't want this marriage, let's talk about how we're going to survive it. Stephanie crossed her legs and tilted her head slightly. Survive it? Yes, Peter said. My father expects us to play the perfect couple. That means public appearances, family events, interviews. I assume you're willing to do that. Stephanie smiled. Of course. Peter studied her carefully. There was something too smooth about her agreement, too effortless. It was as if she had already prepared for this conversation before even stepping into the room. That put him on edge. I need to know what you expect from this, he said. Are you looking for anything in particular? Money? Influence? Stephanie laughed softly. You think I'm marrying you for money? Peter raised an eyebrow. Aren't you? Her smile didn't fade. Believe it or not, Peter, I'm not as desperate as you think. I can take care of myself. That answer bothered him. Because if she wasn't marrying him for money, then what was she after? Before he could ask, Stephanie leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. Let's get one thing straight. I don't like being controlled any more than you do. So here's what I suggest. We give your father exactly what he wants in public, and in private, we live our lives however we choose. No questions, no interference. Peter considered her words. It sounded reasonable, almost too reasonable, but he had no other choice. Fine, he said. But if you ever try to interfere in my life, this deal is over. Stephanie's lips curled into a smirk. The same goes for you. They shook hands. The agreement was set. But neither of them knew just how much this marriage would change everything. The Anderson family didn't do anything small. 2 months later, Peter and Stephanie's wedding became the most talked about event of the year. Every major media outlet covered it. The guest list was filled with billionaires, celebrities, and politicians. The grand ballroom of the Anderson estate was transformed into a fairy tale setting, with chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds and floral arrangements that covered every corner. Peter stood at the altar, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo. He felt like a stranger at his own wedding. The past 2 months had been a whirlwind of preparations, interviews, and public appearances. Stephanie played her role perfectly, always smiling, always saying the right things. She was a mystery, one he couldn't quite solve. And then she appeared. Stephanie walked down the aisle in a breathtaking white gown, her long dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She moved with the grace of a queen, her expression calm and composed. Peter watched her carefully. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked untouchable, like she had already won. As she reached the altar, she met his gaze and smiled. A smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. After the ceremony, the reception was a blur of handshakes, speeches, and flashing cameras. Peter played his part, smiling for the guests, holding Stephanie's hand, whispering sweet nothings in her ear when the cameras were on them. But behind the scenes, everything was different. By the time they entered the lavish penthouse that had been arranged for them, the act was over. Stephanie removed her veil and tossed it onto the couch. Well, that was exhausting. Peter loosened his tie, exhaling. "Tell me about it." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Stephanie walked over to the bar, pouring herself a drink. "Want one?" Peter hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." She handed him a glass of whiskey, then took a sip of her own. "This is the part where we discuss living arrangements," she said. Peter sat down on one of the leather chairs. "Go ahead. I assume you don't want to share a room?" Peter let out a short laugh. "Definitely not." Stephanie smirked. "Good. I already had a separate bedroom prepared." Peter studied her, taking a sip of his drink. "You really planned everything, didn't you?" Stephanie met his gaze. "I like to be prepared." Something about the way she said it made him uneasy. But he let it go.
"Fine," he said.
"You do your thing, I'll do mine." Stephanie nodded. "Perfect." She turned to leave, but then stopped at the door. "Oh, and Peter?" He looked up. She smiled. "Try not to fall in love with me." And with that, she walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Peter let out a slow breath. What had he just gotten himself into? Days turned into weeks. To the world, they were the perfect couple. They attended charity galas, made appearances at business events, and smiled for the cameras. The press adored them. But behind closed doors, they barely spoke. Stephanie was always busy. She attended meetings, met with influential people, and handled projects Peter had never heard of. She was up to something. And Peter was determined to find out what. One evening, he came home earlier than usual. Stephanie was in her study, typing away on her laptop. She didn't notice him standing at the door. He watched as she closed one tab and opened another. For a brief second, he saw a document with his father's name on it. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. His chest tightened. What was she doing? Stephanie glanced up and saw him watching. She smiled. "Something wrong, Peter?" He forced a smile.
"No.
Just wondering what you're working on." She tilted her head. "Just business." Peter nodded slowly. But he didn't believe her. Stephanie Carter was hiding something. And for the first time since their wedding, Peter realized something. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience. This was a game. And he had no idea who would win. Peter Anderson had spent his entire life navigating the ruthless world of business and power. He was used to deals made in boardrooms, the cold calculations of profit and loss, and the constant pressure of living up to his father's expectations. But this was different. His marriage to Stephanie was no ordinary arrangement, it was a game. And he was starting to think he might be losing. Ever since the night he caught a glimpse of that mysterious document with his father's name on it, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that Stephanie was hiding something big. She was always busy. Meetings, phone calls, trips outside the city without any real explanation. Whenever he asked, she gave vague answers. "It's just business." He knew that wasn't the full truth. But what kind of business was she really handling? One night, after another charity event where they had played the perfect couple for the cameras, Peter decided he was done waiting for answers. Stephanie had just finished removing her jewelry when he leaned against the bedroom door and folded his arms. "Stephanie, let's stop pretending for a second." She raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into that signature smirk of hers. "Pretending about what?" This marriage might be fake, but I'm not blind. I know you're up to something. Stephanie's expression didn't change. If anything, she seemed amused. What exactly do you think I'm up to? Peter took a step closer. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Stephanie chuckled, unbothered. Oh, Peter, she said in a slow, mocking tone. If you want to play detective, go ahead. But I warn you, some truths aren't worth uncovering. Her words sent a chill down his spine. But Peter wasn't the kind of man to back down. For the next week, Peter kept a close eye on Stephanie. He watched her movements, listened to her phone conversations when she wasn't paying attention, and even asked some of his most trusted business associates to look into what she was doing. But every time he thought he had something, she slipped right through his fingers. Stephanie was smart. Too smart. She covered her tracks well, leaving no obvious clues behind. But Peter wasn't giving up. One evening, he noticed her leaving the house dressed in all black, her usual elegance replaced with something more practical. Curious, he followed her. She drove across the city, eventually stopping at an upscale hotel. Peter parked a few cars away and watched as she entered the lobby. A few minutes later, she met with an older man in a dark suit. Peter's stomach twisted. He recognized the man. Jonathan Reed, a former executive in the Anderson family business, until he was fired by Peter's father for allegedly embezzling company funds. What was Stephanie doing with him? Peter stayed outside, watching from a distance. They talked for nearly an hour. When Stephanie finally left the hotel, Peter quickly made his way inside. He found Jonathan Reed sitting at the hotel bar, sipping a glass of whiskey. Peter didn't waste any time. What the hell are you doing with my wife? Jonathan turned, looking mildly surprised. Then he smirked. Well, the golden son himself, he said. I was wondering when you'd start asking questions. Peter clenched his jaw. Answer me. Jonathan took another sip of his drink before setting the glass down. I have nothing to say to you, Peter, he said. But I will say this. Your wife is a lot smarter than you think. And if you don't figure out the truth soon, you're going to regret it. Peter's blood ran cold. Jonathan stood up, patted Peter on the shoulder, and walked away, leaving him with more questions than ever. Peter barely slept that night. His mind raced with possibilities. Why was Stephanie meeting with Jonathan Reed? What did she know? And more importantly, what was she planning? The next morning, he decided to confront her. She was sitting in the garden, reading a book, looking perfectly relaxed, as if she wasn't secretly plotting something behind his back. Peter sat across from her. We need to talk. Stephanie didn't look up.
About what?
About Jonathan Reed. That got her attention. Her grip on the book tightened slightly before she forced a casual smile. You've been following me, haven't you? Peter ignored the accusation. Why were you meeting with him? Stephanie sighed and closed her book. You really want to know? Yes. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but sharp. Your father destroyed my family. Peter blinked. What? Stephanie's eyes darkened. I know you don't remember, Peter. You were too young. But my family used to be powerful, just like yours. We were business partners, until your father decided we were no longer useful. Peter felt his chest tighten. His father had always been ruthless in business. But he had never imagined something like this. Stephanie continued. My father lost everything. We lost everything. My mother didn't survive it. And your family? They moved on like nothing happened. Peter swallowed hard. He had grown up believing his father was a great businessman. Now he wasn't so sure. So, Peter said slowly, this marriage, it's revenge, isn't it? Stephanie didn't deny it. Instead, she gave him a slow, knowing smile. What do you think? That night, Peter sat alone in his office, staring out the window. Everything made sense now. Stephanie hadn't just been playing along. She had been playing him. And the worst part? He couldn't even blame her. If what she said was true, if his father really had destroyed her family, then maybe she had every right to hate them. But where did that leave him? He had spent his whole life trying to prove himself, trying to be better than his father. Now he was trapped in a marriage that had never been about love. And yet, somewhere along the way, He had stopped seeing Stephanie as an enemy. Somewhere along the way, she had become something else. Something dangerous. Something irresistible. Peter let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure how this would end. But one thing was certain. Stephanie Carter was no longer just his wife. She was his greatest threat. And he wasn't sure if he wanted to stop her or let himself fall. Peter sat in his office, staring at the city's skyline through the large glass windows. His mind was a battlefield of emotions: anger, confusion, fascination, and something else he didn't want to admit. Stephanie had revealed her truth, and now he had to decide what to do with it. He knew what his father was capable of. He had spent years ignoring the rumors, excusing the ruthless decisions, convincing himself that his father had done what was necessary for business. But now, for the first time, he questioned everything. Had his family really destroyed hers? And if they had, did that justify what she was doing? Peter exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. He needed answers. And there was only one person who could give them to him. The next morning, Peter made his way to his father's private estate. The older man had retired from daily operations of the Anderson Empire, but still held power over everything. The moment Peter stepped into the study, his father, Richard Anderson, looked up from his paperwork with mild amusement. "To what do I owe this surprise visit?" Richard asked, leaning back in his chair. Peter didn't waste time. "I need to know the truth about the Carter family." A flicker of something passed through his father's eyes before he masked it with a chuckle. "Stephanie's been filling your head with nonsense, hasn't she?" Peter clenched his jaw. "Just answer the question." Richard sighed and stood up, walking to the bar in the corner of the room. He poured himself a glass of whiskey before turning back to Peter. "The Carter family made a fatal mistake," Richard said, his tone calm but firm. "They tried to challenge me. They thought they could compete with the Andersons. So, I did what I had to do." Peter felt his stomach turn. "And what exactly did you do?" "I crushed them before they could become a threat," Richard said simply, taking a sip of his drink. "Their business collapsed, their assets were seized, and their so-called allies abandoned them. It was nothing personal, just business." Peter's hands curled into fists. "You destroyed an entire family's legacy. And you call it just business?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "I did what was necessary to secure our empire. And look where we are now, stronger than ever." Peter shook his head in disgust. Stephanie hadn't been lying. Her family had suffered because of his father's greed. And now, she was in his life, playing a game of revenge. But what if it wasn't just a game anymore? That night, Peter returned home late, his mind heavy with everything he had learned. He found Stephanie sitting in their bedroom, reading under the warm glow of the lamp. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable. "So," she said, "did you get your answers?" Peter hesitated before nodding. Stephanie's lips pressed into a thin line. "And now that you know the truth, what happens next?" That was the question, wasn't it? Peter had spent weeks trying to uncover her secrets, to expose her real intentions. But now that he knew, he wasn't sure what to do with the information. He slowly walked toward her. "Was this always your plan?" he asked. "To marry me, destroy my family from the inside, and then walk away?" Stephanie's gaze didn't waver. "Yes." Her honesty hit him harder than any lie ever could. Peter swallowed. "And now?" Stephanie hesitated. For the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. Peter stepped closer, close enough to see the flicker of conflict in her eyes. "You've spent your whole life hating my family," he said softly. "But do you still hate me?" Stephanie exhaled slowly, setting her book aside. "I don't know," she admitted. The room was silent except for the sound of their breathing. Something had changed between them. Something dangerous. Peter wasn't sure when it had started. Maybe it was the constant push and pull between them, the nights spent arguing, the moments of reluctant understanding. Or maybe it was the way he had stopped seeing her as his enemy and started seeing her as his. Before he could stop himself, he reached out and cupped her face. Stephanie didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch. "I should hate you," she whispered. "But you don't," Peter said. Neither of them moved. Then, in one swift motion, Peter closed the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that was slow, intense, and filled with every unsaid word between them. Stephanie's hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer. And just like that, the lines between love and war shattered completely. The next morning, Peter woke up to an empty bed. Stephanie was gone. At first, he thought she had gone for an early meeting. But then, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Check your father's office. She's already made her move." Peter's blood turned to ice. He grabbed his car keys and drove straight to his father's estate. When he arrived, the guards were in chaos. "What's going on?" Peter demanded. One of the security men ran up to him. "Someone broke into Mr. Anderson's private office last night," he said. "Files were stolen. Sensitive information." Peter's breath caught in his throat. He stormed inside, making his way to his father's office. Richard Anderson was standing behind his desk, furious. Papers were scattered everywhere. "She took them," Richard growled. "Stephanie Carter stole my confidential files." Peter felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. Stephanie had played him. Even after everything that had happened between them, she had gone through with her plan. He had let himself believe she might change her mind. He had been a fool. His father turned to him, eyes narrowing. "You knew, didn't you?" Peter clenched his fists. "I didn't." "Don't lie to me, boy," Richard snapped. "She seduced you, got close enough to use you, and now she's disappeared with information that could destroy this family." Peter's stomach twisted. Stephanie had spent weeks building his trust. She had made him believe that something real was growing between them. But in the end, she had done exactly what she had planned from the start. She had betrayed him, and now she was gone.
Peter didn't waste time.
He had to find Stephanie before it was too late. If she exposed whatever was in those files, it wouldn't just ruin his father. It could bring down the entire Anderson empire. And as much as he hated his father's methods, he wasn't going to let his family be destroyed. Stephanie had made her move. Now it was his turn. Peter Anderson was going to hunt her down. And this time, he wouldn't let her slip away. Peter gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced as he sped through the city streets, chasing a ghost. Stephanie had disappeared without a trace, and he had no idea where to find her. But he wasn't going to stop. She had played him, lied to him, used him. And worst of all, he had let her. A part of him had hoped she would choose him over her revenge. But now, he had no choice but to stop her before she destroyed everything.
His phone rang.
It was his father. "Have you found her?" Richard Anderson's voice was sharp with anger. "I'm working on it," Peter said through clenched teeth. Richard scoffed. "Work faster. If she releases those documents, we lose everything." Peter exhaled sharply. What exactly is in those files? A long pause. Then his father spoke, his voice lower this time. Evidence of things that should never see the light of day. Peter's stomach churned. He had always known his father operated in the gray areas of business. But if these files were dangerous enough to bring down their empire, what had Richard really done? And was Stephanie wrong for trying to expose it?
Peter shook his head. He couldn't think about that now.
He had to find her. Peter called every connection he had, looking for any trace of Stephanie. She had to be somewhere in the city. She wouldn't just run. She had a plan. After hours of frustration, a breakthrough finally came. One of his sources had spotted her at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Peter wasted no time. He sped across the city, his heart pounding. When he reached the warehouse, the place was dark and silent. But he knew she was inside. Taking a deep breath, he stepped in. Stephanie stood near a table, her laptop open, a flash drive plugged in. She didn't look surprised to see him. "You found me," she said calmly. Peter's jaw tightened. "What's on that flash drive?" Stephanie met his gaze. "The truth." Peter took a slow step closer. "What truth?" She tilted her head. "Your father has ruined lives, Peter. He destroyed my family, but we weren't the only ones. These files contain proof, illegal deals, bribery, money laundering. Everything he's done in the dark. Peter's breath caught. He had known his father was ruthless. But this? Stephanie's voice softened. Do you really want to defend him after everything you know? Peter hesitated. A war waged inside him. If Stephanie released these files, his father would fall. But so would he. Everything his family had built would collapse. I don't know what to believe anymore, he admitted. Stephanie took a step toward him. I never wanted to hurt you, Peter, she said quietly. But I couldn't let your father get away with what he did. Peter studied her, his heart hammering. He saw the anger in her eyes. But he also saw something else. Regret.
Pain.
And maybe a love? He swallowed hard. If you do this, there's no going back. Stephanie nodded. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then she turned back to the laptop. Peter's pulse raced. Stephanie, wait. She hesitated. Peter's voice was barely above a whisper. Is revenge really worth it? Stephanie's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She was shaking. Peter took another step closer. I know you hate my father, he said softly. And maybe you should. But if you do this, if you destroy everything, what happens next? Tears filled Stephanie's eyes. She had spent her whole life chasing this moment. But now, standing on the edge of victory, she felt hollow. What would come after? Would she really feel free? Or just lost? Peter gently took her hands in his. Let's find another way. Stephanie blinked, startled. What? Peter took a deep breath. We don't have to destroy everything. We can expose the truth without burning the whole world down. Stephanie shook her head. Your father will never let that happen. Then I'll stand against him, Peter said firmly. But I don't want to lose you in the process. Stephanie searched his face. She had spent so long seeing Peter as the enemy. But he wasn't his father. He was different. He had always been different. Slowly, she reached up and touched his face. You do that, she whispered. Peter nodded. For you? Yes. Stephanie swallowed hard. Then, with trembling hands, she pulled out the flash drive. Peter exhaled in relief. But the battle wasn't over yet. Peter and Stephanie returned to the Anderson estate together. Richard was waiting for them. The moment he saw Stephanie, his face darkened. I assume you've come to gloat, he said coldly. Stephanie lifted her chin.
No.
I came to tell you that your time of controlling everything is over. Richard scoffed. And how do you plan to stop me? Peter stepped forward. With the truth. Richard's eyes flickered with something dangerous. You would betray your own blood for her? Peter clenched his jaw. I'm not betraying anyone. I'm choosing what's right. Richard's gaze hardened. If you do this, you're no son of mine. Peter held his ground. Then, I guess I never was. A tense silence followed. For the first time, Richard Anderson realized he had lost. Not just his empire, but his son. Stephanie took Peter's hand, and together, they walked away. Richard didn't stop them, because deep down, he knew he had already been defeated. Months later, the Anderson Empire was restructured. Richard lost his position of power, and a new, ethical leadership took over. The crimes he had committed were brought to light, but instead of complete destruction, Peter and Stephanie had worked to fix what could be salvaged. Stephanie finally got justice. But more importantly, she found something she never expected.
Love.
As she stood on the balcony of their new home, Peter wrapped his arms around her from behind. Do you regret it? He asked softly. Stephanie smiled. No, she whispered. For the first time in my life, I feel free. Peter kissed her shoulder. And as the sun set on their past, they looked forward to a future neither of them had ever imagined. Together. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.